maybe belly fat's not the villain that we've kind of made it out to be.
That belly fat is incredibly flexible, provide the body with massive amounts of energy. Bombarding that tissue with storage needs, that's where we see the spillover, if you will, into these other tissues that then cause, downstream consequences as well.
Hello to Healthspan community. My name is Rich LaFountain, senior scientist and part of the clinical team at Healthspan. I'm excited to continue part of one of our new initiatives. We're really trying to reinforce our pillars within the education side of Healthspan. We want to educate and equip the amazing patients we have at Healthspan with a comprehensive toolkit to extend healthy living as well as the community beyond. So we have a great episode planned today. We're going to talk to Dr. Aaron Slusher about the surprising role of abdominal subcutaneous fat as a metabolic buffer and how to target that and reprogram that adipose tissue, perhaps with endurance training and maybe even some other forms of exercise. So with that, I'm super excited to get into this topic. It's an area that I'm highly interested in. I've done some research with exercise and similar interests kind of overlap with Dr. Slusher. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to combine some of this great work with the research review he just published into our current protocols at Healthspan to help additionally serve our patients and the community. So if you're following along, if you've seen any of these previous episodes, if you have a specific topic you're interested in, we would love to hear about that. If you want to drop that idea in the comment, we would absolutely give some time and thought to putting either a research review or an episode like this together where we could find an expert in the field and dive into that for you. So with all that said, again, we have Dr. Aaron Slusher joining us. Aaron completed his research and scholarship at a variety of institutions, including Yale, Virginia Commonwealth University, and a postdoc at the University of Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. So I won't hold that against him. I'm thrilled that he's here. And again, he recently published a very strong research review. There's a very detailed kind of walk through some of the research that specifically targets that abdominal subcutaneous fat, which is a very, very important depot of fat on the human body that we hear about also often. So with that, let's start the show. Aaron, thank you very much for taking some time to explore this topic with us. I would love for you to provide some greater insight, and I'm looking forward to learning on my end as well. If you don't mind, could you just kick us off with a brief introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, Rich, nice to meet you. I think I saw the Blocko behind you a moment ago. I'll caveat this conversation. My wife is an Ohio State alumni. My mother and father-in-law are alumni there, brother-in-law. So I married into a family of Buckeyes, and I'm guilty of dipping some Buckeyes at the holiday season. It's a tough rivalry to marry into, but my father-in-law played football for them, so it's especially tough in November during the holiday season. But
I'm positive of that. Yeah,
so
that's awesome.
So just a little bit of background about myself. During college, I was a strength conditioning coach. I worked as a men's soccer coach down in Florida, a small Division I school, and working with the goalkeepers and working with designing the strength conditioning program and working with the human performance department at the school at Florida Gulf Coast University, kind of really spearheaded this passion for sports science and exercise physiology, and served as a really strong motivator for me to enter into grad school, because I was just kind of have this insatiable appetite for what's going on the metabolic cart. What do these numbers really mean? How can I use this information to enhance the performance of the athletes that I'm working with? And I think at the time I thought I was going to go to school, graduate, and work for FC Barcelona and do their program. But I took a detour when I was there, and sort of this new world of research opened up to me, and I started isolating immune cells and sort of messing around with their function. And through that, my research evolved into really trying to understand how physical stress, so exercise and physical activity, mitigate the negative consequences associated with psychological stress, mental or emotional stress. And those two, how they interact on immune cell function and cellular aging as a way to understand the aging process. And at University of Michigan, I as a postdoc, I continued on this research heavily into the aging side, looking at telomere biology. And then at Yale, I transitioned more towards the metabolism side. So understanding what differentiates metabolic health between two otherwise similar populations of children with obesity, yet one population remains insulin sensitive and the other population remains insulin resistant. So I think that has a really nice segue into this article I wrote. On a personal level, I'll just kind of throw it out there. I love trail running. And I think being able to apply the lessons from exercise physiology onto a trail and into that human performance and sort of how it impacts my own health is something that I've developed a passion for in the past 5 years.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. Yeah. My brother, after I went to OSU in true sibling fashion, decided he wanted to go to University of Michigan, did some research there. He did some cool stuff, ended up going to Alaska a few times. But yeah, it seems like we have a little bit of that because the last time I was on with Brandon, and Brandon's a colleague, also works on the clinical team at Healthspan. He's a Penn State guy. So the Big Ten has so far been quite well represented. And yeah, I'm thrilled to meet you. Definitely a ton of alignment along the way with like some of the personal interests. And I found a similar trajectory in terms of once I kind of experienced exercise physiology, nutrition, I kind of jumped ship, for lack of a better term, and like kind of abandoned some plans that I had been working on and I went to grad school because I was just that excited. And I remain that excited this time. So I can't wait to dive into the research that you did. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about your article here, we'll see what we can cover in our allotment of time. So with, your article and some of the big picture, trying to frame this for folks and kind of set some context, there's an element or there's a bit of flipping the script that you're kind of presenting to the readers or the audience in this case, where fat and specifically belly fat, which I would probably challenge almost anybody to go on, to watch either YouTube within the health and wellness space or even a TV show, and not see some kind of ad along the way that's weight loss and targeting belly fat and all that stuff. So maybe belly fat's not the villain that we've kind of made it out to be. Is that true? And can you expand on that a little bit since you're flipping the script on us and we want to keep track of where we're at and some of that knowledge?
Yeah, it's certainly true that it can have negative consequences, but I guess I'll clarify here that when we talk about fat, there are tons of varieties. They're located all across the body. They have different functions. They function differently. Specifically, going to talk about subcutaneous fat, and that is that real thin layer that lies just beneath the skin. That's pinchable, and kind of going from there, that's even stored in different locations. So focusing on the abdominal region, the belly fat, I said that's where we have a lot of these like personal societal views that vary, pretty drastically. On a personal level, we might, speak negatively about ourselves because we don't like the way we look, or societal views, we might experience discrimination if we have excess belly fat. And so those are certainly the negative sides. That is essentially a very misunderstood organ. Essential. We need it to live, not just a passive location for storing excess fat, though we'll talk about that capacity here moving forward. But it secretes hormones that regulate our appetite. It serves as insulation to help regulate body temperature. It's going to provide a layer of cushioning among a number of other functions. So I think the most interesting part that we'll talk about today is as we learn more, we're understanding more and more about how subcutaneous adipose tissue in that abdominal region, that belly fat, is vital to maintaining metabolic health. And this is a process that is enhanced just physical activity, but also exercise. So I think the hope is to kind of reframe it a little bit, come to a better appreciation of, let's not focus so much on the amount of belly fat per se, but more on the adaptability and the functional capacity of this organ. And then how do we harness that physiology to improve our health span?
Love that. Yeah, I appreciate the clarification and the reframe for sure. I'm familiar with the pinchable belly fat, or the pinchable sub-Q fat, I guess is probably the more accurate way to describe it. Probably you are as well from like exercise science, and you find yourself with skin fold calipers on, very early on. That's the great icebreaker when you come into an exercise science program and you're new to the department, or you come to the first day of class. Often you're going to be immediately kind of taught that lesson and then have to do that, which is, again, great way to meet people and make new friends. So with that, I know you talked a little bit about some of the stigma around, and I'm certainly familiar. I became a dad in 2018, but I've been kind of fighting dad bod since I was probably, in my early teenage years or maybe before. So I guess, yeah, there is a bit of a stigma there. So I'm looking forward to, especially when we get into some of the exercise stuff, there's things you can do. There's definitely research supported ways to go about targeting some of this. If this is, if belly fat or subcutaneous fat, something that you want to improve upon. But I'm interested, you said in your article, you mentioned that fat can be stored in the right place. I'm interested to hear more about, for specifically like the abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue. How is this metabolically safer than other fat storage locations on the body?
Yeah, that's one of the big functions that I think we're learning more and more about is how subcutaneous adipose tissue in the abdominal region stores fat in a healthy way. I think as we learn more, we realize that there's a certain amount of assistance that's required. So we need sufficient blood flow. We need structural support. We need an immune profile in that microenvironment that is regulated and not sort of a runaway in one direction or the other. I think ultimately, under the right circumstances, that belly fat is incredibly flexible. So when nutrients are abundant, it can expand and store lipids. When nutrients are scarce, reduce in size, it can provide the body with massive amounts of energy. Evolutionary perspective, I like to think of biology and really anything we do from this perspective. It makes a lot of sense. Certainly, subcutaneous adipose tissue is not unique to humans. You see it across species. But from our perspective, course of our evolution and the emergence of our species 200,000-300,000 years ago, we likely evolved this hunter-gatherer type of. So we would spend a lot of time looking for food, and this was physically taxing. And sometimes we were really successful at persistent hunting. So we were rewarded with amounts of food, nutriently dense meat that we needed a way to store. This wasn't something we were necessarily getting every day. We needed to store those excess calories when available to do that efficiently. We also needed to survive when maybe we weren't as successful, when nutrients were scarce. And so we went through these fluctuations that in order to survive, it seems like subcutaneous adipose tissue sort of took on this responsibility and allowed us to navigate this environment. In fact, fat cells are capable of expanding multitudes in size on certain situations. And so I think in today's modern environment, we're sort of stressing this expansion capacity under different circumstances, however. So we're not as physically, plus are probably pretty fortunate that we have a readily available amount of nutrients available to us whenever we want. So we're not going through that food scarcity that we might have had a couple 100,000 years ago. So we're exploiting this function and it may not be able to handle it. The result, that's where we start to see that metabolic dysregulation.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Full agreement there. I think that we're in a different nutritional challenge, an overabundance challenge as opposed to, periodic or routine scarcity for many people. And we're maybe not caught up on an evolutionary basis to some of that, which might be giving rise to challenges with fat storage or, obesity related diseases, that type of thing. So I appreciate that a ton. With that being said, so you have this abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue depot that has some flexibility. It can expand. What happens when you're kind of mentioning that, like, we're maybe surpassing our ability in a lot of cases for this fat depot to accommodate, like the one abundant meal where you might have a gap in some of your nutrition that's evolutionarily kind of been played out is different than chronically overindulging or just having an abundance of calories that are more routine. So when abdominal subcutaneous fat or ABSAT, if I say ABSAT or you say ABSAT, it's just abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue, but it just rolls off the tongue a lot nicer. So if your ABSAT can't keep up to the demands of fat storage, like, is that a turning point for metabolic dysfunction, or how does that relate?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kind of lay a little bit of a foundation here that I mentioned we need to support the ability of the fat, or it seems that we need to be able to support the environment that makes fat conducive for storing. Kind of three big areas, and there are others, but three big areas have sort of emerged, at least, specifically to this paper. We'll kind of focus on those. So the first is, we need adequate blood flow. So we need capillary density. We need a blood vessel network that can, deliver oxygen and nutrients and remove waste. We need what's called an extracellular matrix. This is like, collagen type proteins that form essentially like a scaffolding to help support the growth and excess mass of the absat. And so it kind of provides a structural framework, but also don't want excess fibrous collagen like proteins that can kind of constrict and bind and make the expansion, less capable. So it's almost like, blowing up a balloon in a small cage. It's just going to reach a certain point and it's going to get restricted. So that collagen, that fibrous matrix can also do that. So in addition to providing the framework, it can be restrictive. And then we have the immune cell profile. So resident macrophages are kind of a hallmark here that we talk about, and they sort of balance the anti versus pro-inflammatory environment. They also secrete these proteins that enter into circulation that can then drive a more immune regulatory profile or a pro-inflammatory environment. And under healthy conditions, the adipose tissue is supported by these and other characteristics. We're fasted. At a fasting point, I think to kind of highlight the importance of this depot in general is that when we're fasted, those triglycerides that are stored, the lipids that are stored, they're going to be broken down into free fatty acids and glycerol. And when we measure the fatty acids in circulation, 70% are coming from this abdominal subcutaneous adipose region. So that's a pretty large amount of fats that are entering and leaving this depot. And so we consume food going into this process where we no longer need those fatty acids and glycerol necessarily to provide energy for the body because we get it through the food and through that digestive process. So we're going to increase the storage, and insulin is going to play a really big role in this process. So we consume food, bigger levels are going to increase, and they're going to stimulate insulin release from the pancreas, and insulin is going to act on the fat cells in that abdominal region to inhibit the breakdown of lipids. And so it's also going to facilitate the uptake of glucose from the liver and skeletal muscle so we can store it as glycogen. When we have this excess expansion capacity or storage exceeds the ability to the framework that supports the expansion, that sufficient blood flow, the fibrosis, or the increased inflammatory stress, those tissue becomes resistant to insulin. And as a result, insulin is no longer able to stop the breakdown of lipids. Lipids travel and are stored elsewhere. So the visceral adipose depot, that's the sort of a fat that surrounds those internal organs that is really closely associated with disease pathology. They're also going to store in the liver, so fatty liver disease as a consequence, or get stored in the skeletal muscle. When lipids are stored in those tissues, specifically the liver and skeletal muscle, we have what's called lipid-induced insulin resistance. And so those two tissues are extremely important for taking up glucose and storing it as glycogen. No longer able to do that. This creates this cycle that actually can end up exacerbating these results. So it's almost like a feed-forward mechanism that then, as these metabolic complications ensue, that sort of serves as a foundation for chronic age-related diseases that we see: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, and even cancers. You can kind of see where we want a really tight regulation of expansion and release when needed. But if we're sort of constantly bombarding that tissue with storage needs and the framework is not there to support it, that's where we see the spillover, if you will, into these other tissues that then cause, downstream consequences as well.
Yeah, definitely a big fan of the balloon in a cage analogy. I appreciate the visual. I could definitely see that in my head, and it makes a lot of sense. I know you mentioned insulin. There was a phrase that you used in your article that I'm a big fan of. I'll probably borrow or I'll cite you whenever I use it, but exquisite sensitivity of ABSAT to insulin. And then you kind of linked it to inhibition of fatty acid breakdown, especially in this postprandial state or in a state where insulin may be elevated. And sometimes that's not just limited to postprandial. Sometimes that's just a disease pathology that's, related to insulin resistance or something. So I'm intrigued by this exquisite sensitivity to insulin. Can you tell me or tell us a little bit more, myself and the audience, a little bit more about how that's regulated and maybe some linkages along the way if there's, insulin level sensitivity versus fat storage. And I've heard, and I'm familiar with, different lines of research with really to, fasting or low carb or ketogenic type nutrition interventions where insulin can kind of make the call, so to speak, as opposed, are you going to be more in a fat burning state or are you going to be more in a fat storage state? So this is super intriguing. I'd love to get your thoughts there if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I also borrowed that term, exquisitely sensitive paper in 2018 that was written by a senior author. It was the lab I worked in at Yale. And that was one that was used quite frequently. And I think it's stuck for good reason. I think one of the little known functions of adipose tissue is this fact that it's extremely insulin sensitive. So this is, really critical because insulin's ability to suppress the breakdown of fat and control plasma fatty acid levels in circulation is really critical to maintaining blood sugar levels. So when we consume a meal, 90% of fatty acid suppression occurs within like 5 to 10 minutes. So it's extremely fast. I think physiologically speaking, that's always kind of, you caused me to raise my eyebrows a little bit, and that's been shown in humans and rodents. That's a really fast process, and it doesn't take a lot. When we think about it, it's the postprandial insulin concentration. So normal metabolically healthy environment, it's in food, your normal insulin levels are secreted, and that whole process is inhibited pretty quickly. And this sort of what we determine as like a metabolic elasticity is so this ability to respond to these different metabolic states or levels of nutrient availability, the fasted versus fed state, the underconsumption versus the overconsumption state. This is also vital to maintaining that metabolic homeostasis. And impairments in this flexibility, mentioned above, or what kind of drive some of these metabolic disruptions. An example of fuel utilization is that metabolic elasticity diminishes in sort of that process that I described a few minutes ago. There's sort of a direct pathway that explains that decreased ability of liver and skeletal muscle to respond to insulin. So that's that lipid-induced insulin resistance. There's a direct pathway that decreases their ability to take up glucose, to store glycogen for later use, and it's going to alter their ability to utilize fuel sources. So how this negatively impacts metabolic flexibility, I think hopefully this answers the question. For listeners, metabolic flexibility, as I understand it, is that bioenergetic of the tissue and their ability to switch between fats and glucose. And so for the skeletal muscle, this is really worrisome because this tissue is pretty large. It's throughout our body, and it's responsible for 80 to 90% of insulin-mediated glucose uptake. So if you're impairing that uptake of glucose by 80 to 90% in this tissue, it's not there to be used as fuel, right? So we're impairing the ability to store this glycogen for later use. So it's going to have to adapt. So I think that if that answers your question, that's sort of a direct line from one consequence in the elasticity and the ability of the adipose tissue to be adaptable and flexible, then translates into these other tissues as a consequence and their ability to be flexible metabolically.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm new to the term, but I'm a big fan. I guess you're full of new phraseology that I can't wait to start utilizing a little bit more regular when I'm discussing or writing about some of these topics. But metabolic elasticity I'm familiar with metabolic flexibility, and just like you said, like that seamless switching. But the elasticity to me is like it's just a really cool descriptor of what might be going on with respect to maybe ABSAT and how you might be able to buffer I immediately go to like elasticity and kind of thinking of rubber bands, or on like a skeletal muscle side. Not that I've experienced this, and I hope I never do, but having like a muscle rupture because it's not elastic enough to handle some kind of like stretch and, high force load. But I'm interested to like just differentiate. So like metabolic flexibility, we know is like seamless switching between carbs and fats pretty much. And super important if in an exercise scenario, if you're maybe doing some endurance exercise or you want to switch to sprinting or that type of activity, you're going to want to be able to switch your fuel source pretty quickly to be able to perform that change in your exercise. But with the elasticity, is this something like on a nutrition side? Would it be like if you splurged at a meal or, it's whatever, it's a birthday, you're out with friends or family, you're eating dinner, I was a big fan of Chinese food buffets at one time. And like, was I then deploying potentially my ABSAT or this metabolic elasticity to accommodate like this, maybe a stretch in terms of my indulgence or overindulgence splurging at a meal? Not that I condone some of those behaviors that we would try to get our money's worth, but it was a good time.
Yeah, I might suggest that, at least in my understanding, it's less maybe on the acute meal specific
Okay.
line. But, a really great example of where this might come into play would be any sort of long-term endeavor that, if somebody wants to go hike the Appalachian Trail, they're really stressing that elasticity, right? So they're constantly trying to get the foods in, also constantly trying to get nutrients in so they can fuel their activity. On the other side, you might think of the holiday season as a really great example where you have multiple family gatherings that's centered around friends and family consuming food at a table. So you're in this condensed period of time, a month or so, 6 weeks, where there is just a lot of celebration of being around people, and it centers around snacks. It centers around the big meal. It centers around desserts. It centers around leftovers. And it's not just a holiday on a calendar. It's sort of a period of time, long weekends, multiple days stretched together where there's a tendency to, probably eat more than you would under different circumstances. So how our fat is able to handle these changes in, energy availability and nutrient availability and storage requirements. And these changes happen not just, at the meal, but they can change at the gene expression level as well. So fasted versus highly fed, we're young, we exhibit a certain amount of elasticity that I think allows us to adopt pretty favorably as we get older, or if we are in a state condition where we have obesity, that elasticity can be altered. I don't know of the study yet per se that says exercise throughout these periods, maintain it the way you might see when you're young, but I'd venture to guess that it would at least make it more favorable and more like what we see we are younger, where we have a little bit more elasticity. That kind of gets to that question of, how this term is applicable in our daily life. And not that I want people around the holiday table thinking about the elasticity and metabolic elasticity of their belly fat, but knowing that's sort of, for me, that's a really cool time to think about the science and how it applies to my, how it fits into my daily life while I'm around friends and family.
For sure. Yeah. And thank you for the differentiation, like the acute versus a little bit more of a longer term, maybe not quite seasonal, but that example around the holidays, I think that resonates really well. That makes a lot more sense, that maybe it's not, as tight a timeline as an hour, couple hours with this acute overindulgence, but it might be days or, a few meals at least. So that's amazing and super helpful. Definitely, it would appear, you would like to have as much metabolic flexibility and elasticity as you can, or maintain that in order to extend health span, stave off disease, or potentially so-called the age-related diseases. So with that, maybe shift gears a little bit, just because you kind of brought it up, which is Beautiful. You mentioned that there's definitely, some exercise impact. So within this article, you did center on the exercise benefit, or the way that your exercise can program or reprogram your abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue to maybe be more elastic, or just improve the overall health of that particular fat storage depot. So do you want to break that down just for us a little bit? We'll dive into that with some time that we have left.
Yeah, this is such a cool area of study. I've been really fascinated by fat physiology, if you will, throughout my graduate career. It wasn't until recently that I was able to study it directly. Um, but simultaneously during that time, there were a couple of really great papers done by Jeff Warwick's lab at the University of Michigan that I think is safe to say that he's at the forefront of this topic in the context of exercise. The science is still trying to figure it out, but what his research has shown is that physical activity and exercise, I think an important thing here is that a variety of types of physical activity and exercise is really supportive environment that helps preserve or improve the function of abdominal fat, the spectrum of metabolic needs. So when we're exercising, we're stimulating the growth and development of blood vessels. So that's ensuring that if our fat cells are growing, that they're also growing in an environment where they're able to receive nutrients and blood flow and oxygen, and we're able to remove the waste that's produced from cells. Exercise enhances the collagen profile. So that structurally sound scaffolding that we talk about to support growth and expansion. If that's occurring concomitantly with nutrient excess, ideally exercise is really able to support or help us weather that period of nutrient excess. It's also preventing or altering the profile so we're not getting that, rigorous, that stiff, fibrous collagen that I mentioned that sort of restricts the growth and maybe suffocates it a little bit, if you will. And finally, exercise is kind of long been viewed as one of the best anti-inflammatory strategies that we have. So we have, on one hand, we have anti-inflammatory immune cells and we have pro-inflammatory immune cells, and the profiles and the abundance and the number of each can shift depending on our metabolic state. So if we are metabolically healthy, we likely have the more anti-inflammatory immune cells. As we become metabolically less healthy or exceeding that storage capacity, we sort of see this shift, pro-inflammatory immune cells that are secreting these proteins and then have these negative effects on these cells' function. So exercise is really great for not just reducing the number of immune cells, but sort of shifting them away from that pro and back towards that more anti-regulated profile that we're seeking into when we look into this tissue. And so all these changes are, essentially having what seems to be a pretty strong impact on the ability of fat tissue to expand and store lipids safely. And so when necessary, if we need to store excess lipids, the framework and the environment is conducive so that we are able to do so. So in this particular study, they remove the fat cells, put them in this really controlled cell culture environment, and under conditions that would allow them to measure the expandability of their fat cells. And what they found is that those that were exercising have a greater expansion capacity. Likewise, those that have greater expansion capacity with all these other more advantageous environmental parameters, they also showed better insulin sensitivity. So in response to an oral glucose tolerance test. So you take a bolus of glucose and over a couple hours, you measure glucose concentrations, you measure insulin concentration, you can measure fatty acid concentrations. And it's a way to see how your body responds to the ingestion of glucose. And so those that were exercising had, they had a pretty nice glucose curve, but the amount of insulin required to lower the glucose was less. Glucose returned to normal quicker. And then you also saw a reduction in the fatty acid concentrations. So that speaks to that sensitivity that we talked about and suppressing the breakdown of lipids. So So all these parameters induced by exercise is ultimately translating to improved metabolic profiles. And this is essential for protecting against that spillover into the skeletal muscle, and also downstream preventing long diseases.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely impactful research without a doubt. It's amazing that like there's nothing exercise really like doesn't touch that it seems to have a positive impact on, aside from certain disease states where exercise actually can accelerate certain pathophysiology. But yeah, by and large, like one of the reasons I was drawn to exercise science, and maybe potentially you as well, not only is it I consider it fun to do and many other people, but it also is like, it's just so effective in terms of like a per unit time effort. Exercise, like that pluripotent benefits are amazing. So I'm interested. I do want to get into maybe some of your thoughts on if you were to prescribe like a certain, endurance exercise regimen for folks. But before we get into that, if you could quickly give me an idea. I like exercise. I'm not opposed to endurance exercise, but I'm also a big fan of resistance training and high intensity interval training. Are the outcomes similar with different forms of exercise? Has the research gotten there, or, is it kind of right now we know about endurance? It has a lot of positive effects, and that's kind of where we've kind of packaged things up at the moment.
Yeah, I think we spend more time studying the endurance exercise. So I think the body of literature is just more supportive for endurance exercise, but that certainly doesn't suggest that resistance training is not also extremely supportive. So support the ability to maintain weight. It does support preventing future weight gain, just like endurance exercise. It does seem to have a role in reducing fat stores, and that's both the visceral as well as subcutaneous. I think the next step would definitely be to look at some of the structural changes that we talked about, what the Forwards Lab has been able to do, and kind of understand the microenvironment and the physiology and the physiological responses to various stressors. As resistance training elicit those? Like, I can't say, it may be out there. I'm just not as familiar. Being said, I think you said it, there are an enormous number of benefits that we gain that even if we don't know, it's unlikely to be negative. And so you're gaining all these other benefits, and it's quite possible that some of these other adaptations are occurring maybe in a different way, or maybe to different magnitudes, or the benefits that you gain from resistance training warrant adding it, I think, to your health routine. I mean, I've long been interested in resistance training. I don't think I enthusiastically do it every week the way I enjoy going out for a trail run, but I've created, an environment that sort of eliminates a lot of barriers for me to do it. So I kind of eliminated my excuses for skipping it, and I engage in it every week. And I think for most people, if depending on their goals and their experience level, you can get a really great resistance training program completed and twice a week, 30 minutes a day, and kind of working up from there. And that should be enough time to sort of target major muscle groups and see some of these adaptations that we, including that reduction in fat size.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to some more research, or maybe even another research review where we look specifically at different exercise modalities. But I think, that's amazing. Endurance exercise has that great body of literature behind it. And if you were to kind of speculate or provide some guidance in terms of like sessions per week or, intensity, how would you target endurance exercise or exercise specifically to really have this impact on like the subcutaneous adipose tissue response to? Is it like a certain heart rate target? Is like, what does that look like, if you don't mind me asking, for like a practical application?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about what we see in the literature is it seems like most forms of exercise are going to have a positive impact. And I'm sure there is a minimum intensity for most studies. They maybe they go as low as 30%, 50%, 70% of max heart rate. A lot of studies are going to kind of center around 65% and 70% for like a moderate intensity. If into high intensity, we might look at like a 90% for easy numbers to sort of pinpoint in a lab and so forth. But if we remove some of that rigidity, I think one of the really nice things about some of the work the Horwitz's lab has done is they essentially gave people the option of how they wanted to exercise. Do you want to run on a treadmill, an elliptical rider? Do you want to be on a bike? Do you want to be on a row machine? And they weren't able to say one was better than the other. That kind of lends me to say that whatever you enjoy, if you're doing it at a moderate intensity, would be something that your heart rate's definitely getting up. Breathing is definitely increased, but you're still able to maybe carry on a conversation, maybe not as fluidly as this, but if you need to take, an extra breath every now and then, you keep on talking, probably at that moderate intensity. If you're at the point where your heart's at kind of bumping pretty fast and you're trying to catch your breath, you're probably at that higher intensity. Both of which seem to elicit the same response as far as we can tell from the study design that we used. Saw those results, observed those results, body composition improved, respiratory fitness levels, VO2max, improved capillary density, improved collagen profiles, and then actually a reduction in fat cell size in as little as 10, 12 weeks. And so I think for those that need a prescription, it's, aim for 90 minutes of higher intensity, aim for 150 minutes of that moderate intensity. Feel free to mix it up as much as you want. And the way in which you get that through the course of a week probably isn't as, it's sort of how it fits into your schedule.
Yep.
5 days of 30 minutes is probably going to be the same as 3 days at 50 minutes. And that's a good place to start. If we're getting into training for some sort of event, then we can talk about maybe playing around with those numbers a little bit because your goals are different. But if your goal is just to get physical activity, those are really good numbers to aim for.
Okay. Yeah. I appreciate you got a little bit into the time frame. That was going to be my follow-up in terms of like with this, someone really is inspired and excited about the research review and hearing about this great work that you highlighted. They want to know, like, how long before meaningful changes? Like, what should I look to invest before I'm, on the lookout hunting for, or maybe assessing through lab values or some other, body composition metric before I see the changes that I'm after, and like adding exercise and kind of shifting the health and then maybe the volume of subcutaneous adipose tissue in the abdominal region specific. So I just, want to reiterate again, seemed like what you were saying was the modality may not be as important. So pick something that you have some enjoyment from doing. Target roughly 150 minutes a week at least. If if you're on the more higher intensity side of things, then you might be able to cut that back potentially to 90 minutes. Is that correct?
I think those are good suggestions. I think, I guess to give you an example of how this translates, their study in 2012, they compared the higher intensity to a moderate intensity that was continuous. So for the moderate intensity that was continuous, they did 45 minutes at a time per session. Laugh was at about 70%. So again, that's a percentage over heart rate that you can probably talk if you need to.
Probably zone 2 for a lot of people.
Yeah, and then for the higher intensity, they started off with a 3-minute warm-up, the intensity, and then they did 10 1-minute bouts separated by 1 minute. And then they followed up with a 3-minute cool down. And the cool down was a slightly lower intensity than the moderate intensity running that the other group did. Their one bout of higher intensity was at 90% of their rates. So comparing two different strategies, two different intensities, what we can kind of conclude here is that the HIT group elicited the same benefits in about 25 minutes per session, whereas the moderate group elicited those benefits in about 45 minutes.
Okay.
So I don't think people need to choose one or the other. I like to play around with both. Sometimes I just really like to go fast, or when I say fast, it's relative to me. I like to feel like I'm moving faster, my own capabilities. Other times I like to just go for a nice, easy, sort of more meditative. I get benefits from both of them, and you get different benefits from both of them. But we're discussing the adaptations to the subcutaneous adipose tissue itself. Those adaptations appear to be statistically the same. So I think if you're looking for rigidity, you can find it. If you're looking for flexibility, like, you certainly play around with things that you like and mix and match.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. That's great news for, people with busy schedules. You kind of have an option available to you. Make sure you're safe with the higher intensity stuff. But then, you're looking for something a little bit low and slow, and you just don't want to have that large sympathetic drive from the high intensity, or you're just kind of feeling mentally a little bit taxed. Sometimes that, low, slow is beautiful. Like you said, the meditative kind of benefit that might work its way in at the lower intensities is quite nice in some cases. So yeah, Dr. Slusher, Aaron, appreciate your time today a ton. Any last points you want to make or clarify that you felt either I was leading you one way and you wanted to make sure that you just clarified for the audience, or anything at all that you'd like to provide additional here at the end?
Kind of a final message is we have talked a little bit about exercise protocols. We've talked about times and intensities. I think for some people, those numbers mean a little less in sport performance. Training for trail runs follow certain prescriptions or certain stressors that come from different types of activities, whereas other people, that's not in any way their goal. And they can gain certainly many other benefits just being physically active, whether it's hiking on trails, have a bike that you like to just ride and have fun. You gain a lot of mental benefits just from the activity as well. Pushing a stroller, getting outside, working in the yard, all of these types of activities summate. Perhaps you don't need to find a gym with a treadmill. If that's the only place you can do it safely, then I would encourage you. But if you have the option of being able to be in different environments and sort of fitting in bits and pieces of physical activity or exercise throughout your day, there are also options that can have pretty significant compounding over a period of time. So I think just thinking about how you get into the habit of just moving more, I think you'll see some of these same benefits that we've discussed, or even if you aren't following a literature-based protocol, then with more rigidity.
Well, thank you so much
Thanks
again.
much.
Yeah, really appreciate your time and your hard work on the research review. It was amazing, and I learned a ton. I'm sure our audience did as well. So please, if you have any comments or any topics you'd like us to explore next, drop them below, and I'm sure we will hear from Dr. Slusher again in the near future. We're looking forward to some of your other deep research review knowledge, if you don't mind sharing it in the near future.
Sounds great.
We'll
Appreciate
talk
it, Rich.
soon.